Thanks to everyone joining. We're going to give it just a couple minutes and we'll get underway in a bit. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Going to get underway. My name is Wade Crowfoot and I lead our California Natural Resources Agency. And one of the best parts of my job is to moderate these speaker series where we bring together leaders and big thinkers on important priorities across California. And of course, this month and this speaker series, we get to celebrate Native American Heritage Month. During the month of November, we have an opportunity to lift up and to celebrate the traditions, the culture, the stewardship, the lifeways, and leadership of California Native Americans. And so this month we have a number of events. We have a set of leaders across our agency that come together every year to plan for us some wonderful events. We started it off at the beginning of the month with the second annual Native American Heritage Month Parade here in Sacramento with a really strong contingent from our agency. And then we had a career panel, which took place on Friday, which was all about identifying pathways for folks that are interested in Native American leaders to find careers and grow their careers in state government. And then, of course, today is our speaker series on a fascinating topic, which is we've called this Seasons Change, how climate change is impacting California Native American traditional seasons and practices. So we're really excited to unpack that. And I'll talk a little bit more about our discussion today. But first, I want to share that if you're new to one of these discussions, there's a few things that I can recommend to maximize what you get out of this. The first is to show your chat function or turn on your chat function on your screen. My colleague Geeta Chandra, who does a great job organizing these discussions, staffs that sort of chat function. And as we introduce our speakers, she'll provide more information about them in the chat. And as we share different topics or different things come up, she'll provide links. So it's a great way to follow along and get a little bit more context, a little bit deeper on the conversations that we're talking about. Second is this Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. At any point during our conversation, you can click it and ask us a question or share an observation. We'll see that as panelists. Some questions we'll be able to answer on the keyboard, and once we do, everyone will be able to see both the question and answer. And some questions I'll bring into the discussion. And then lastly, we're recording our conversation here today. So by tomorrow morning, you can go on our website, resources.ca.gov, and you can find a recording of this discussion. And if you'd like to share with others, we encourage that. Along with the recording of the discussion will be a copy of all the information provided in the chat. So you don't have to copy that down. You can find that actually on our website. So with that said, let's get underway. Because tribes have been here since time immemorial, California Native American tribes have a unique and deep-rooted connection to the land. As I've been educated, that stories and practices of how to care for the land, water, air, plants, animals have been passed down over generations, culminating in a rhythm that is in tune with the environment. Now, as we know, and we continue to learn, that rhythm was significantly disrupted over the last several centuries by colonial settlement, by land dispossession, by disconnection of Native American tribal communities with these lifeways. And then more recently, by climate change, whether it's extreme heat, shifts in the timing and intensity of storms, sea level rise, drought, species migration, even eradication of native species, all have impact on these Native American indigenous lifeways that have that have gone on since time immemorial. So today we're, of course, unpacking that. And we're talking about the present and future of tribal stewardship and how tribes are addressing the effects of climate change on these traditional practices, the seasons, and the resources. I shared with the panelists right before we started that one thing I love about these discussions is I always learn, and this is an area I don't really know that much about, and I hope there are many of you who are joining, several hundred actually. We're going to learn just a ton from this remarkable set of panelists that we have joining us today. You'll know in the chat function that that Geeta has already listed them. So I'm going to bring them on in sequential order. And then if we have time at the end, we're going to get into a group conversation. So I'm first very thankful to be joined by Tiana Williams. Tiana has been on a speaker series before as the director of the wildlife department of the Yurok tribe. Um, as many of us know, the Yurok government is leading in so many ways on environmental protection and restoration. Whether it's remarkable ancestral land return, getting land back into the tribe's ownership and stewardship, or the reintroduction of wildlife like the famed California condor. Tiana, huge thanks for all you're doing. Welcome to this. And first, I'd want to ask you just if you could just share a little bit more about this term time immemorial. It's something I've been educated on in this role, and for those who are not native, I think it's helpful to understand what kind of time scale we're talking about.
Absolutely. And thank you again for having me on again. It's always a pleasure. But as mentioned, I'm Tiana Williams. I'm the director for the Yurok Tribe's Wildlife Department, and I'm a Yurok tribal member. I kind of introduced myself additionally as I'm from the village of Wechiquel. And so Wechiquel is at the mouth of the Klamath River on the south side and things like that. And it's a traditional way that I would introduce myself, not only from my place, but also my mother's name is, my grandmother's name is, her mother's name is, because it is very important to being a Yurok person as to where I come from, both temporally and kind of spatially, because I have a direct link to that particular place and time, and also to the future generation. So, my daughter. All of that said, that really ties into that idea of time immemorial, I think. And I think especially in contemporary times, we're really fascinated with numbers and ages and things like that. And so there's been all kinds of studies that say, oh, Native Americans have been here for 12,000 years, for 15,000 years, for 23,000 years. But past a certain point, and regardless of the kind of origin of it all, we've been here for a very long time. Long enough that for me, when it comes to the term time immemorial, we're talking certainly within the framework of thousands upon thousands of years. But more importantly, I think we're talking within the framework of a time frame over which we as Indigenous people have co-evolved with the landscape that we live with. We are thoroughly integrated into it, integral to it, both as kind of recipients of the beautiful things that nature can provide us, but also caretakers of it. So the term time immemorial to me actually really talks about establishing the depth of relationship that Indigenous people have with the lands that they caretake. And so that really ties into what, since the 1980s, has kind of been known as like traditional ecological knowledge. If people aren't familiar with that, there's a lot of interpretations of what that means. These days, I kind of like the phrase indigenous knowledge or indigenous understanding, because these are ways of thinking or ways of understanding the world that aren't necessarily tied to the specifics of management, though there's absolutely things that go along with that. You burn at this time of year or you burn at that time of year for different mechanisms. We leave our fish behind in the river once we, catch and gut them in order to feed the river. There's all kinds of things that are like that, but I think is more importantly tied to, again, those relationships, not only between ourselves, but between all the other members of our wildlife communities, our fish communities, our spiritual relatives, basically, as well as the lands that actually maintain them. So we reintroduced California condor, for example, um, but we didn't just reintroduce a species. When we're talking about a species, we're reintroducing, well, what does it mean for the landscape and all of these other relations as well. And so the traditional ecological knowledge is born out of that kind of sense of time immemorial, because we've been gathering the relationships and understandings and really indigenous science about how the world works together for thousands upon thousands of years, passing it on to the next generation. So time immemorial is a really big idea. It's not just a catchphrase that we throw around. It's something that is very integral to who we are as an indigenous peoples, and we've all got a different relationship in different ways.
That's incredible. And as you point out, the co-evolution of people and place and just the depth of understanding, uh, for me anyways, in this role has been astounding, to spend time with folks from our from tribes that and just the understanding they have of the interaction of what we would all consider to be whether it's the plants and the animals and the landscape. um, it's remarkable. Tiana, so how do you approach sort of the future of tribal stewardship given climate change? And specifically, like what kind of management scale do you think we need to think about when thinking about the effects of climate change? Like how does that impact what you do in your country?
Well, I think there's kind of two scales or there's a continuum of scale, I might say. Because something that I was always taught growing up is you got to be thinking all the time. But basically, that means that you have to recognize that everything that you do or you say or you even think is either going to positively or negatively benefit what we interpret as a balance. Different people's interpret things in different ways, but we're all about balance and world renewal and things like that. Um, so there's definitely this small scale, I think, is we as humanity recognizing that we're a really big part of this ecosystem as individuals and as a whole, so that we need to be individually thinking about all the different things that we can do to help move the world forward in a good way. If we all get on the same page and we all move forward in a good way, then we're going to see good results. But it was referenced as well. We at the Yurok tribe, we like to think on a big scale. For myself, I've been involved in condor restoration since its inception, its implementation in 2008. And as a tribal member, I feel like I've definitely grown in my understanding of that scale to be what I call the condors I scale at this point. And so part of the reason that condors is so important to us is because when we're talking about world renewal, again, we're world renewal people. That's kind of foundational to who we are. We look to Condor, who flies at about 15,000 feet, in order to get that very large perspective on what the world needs. We actually ask Condor to carry our prayers over the world because he's got that high perspective and can carry that good energy. So that said, we work in really big ways. I think one of my I mean, obviously, I love Condor restoration. That's been a really big deal for me. But one of the most exciting things as a tribal member has been the Klamath Dam removal, the removal of four defunct old hydroelectric dams that were basically killing the river. And we were not asked when they got put in. We were told, we tried to say, hey, this is a bad idea. But this idea of progress and supporting human growth was preeminent. And we cannot move forward in that way without ultimately destroying ourselves if we're not thinking in connectivity. So we've got this huge dam removal project, which is has taken the ranks, I think, of at least of the largest in the US, if not in the world at this point. We're talking about we just got 47,000 acres of lands back to tribal management, but even that 47,000 acres is small, right? Because we're going to go in there, we're going to thin out the forest to make it healthy again. We're going to recreate our prairie structure that was taken over when our lands were colonized. We've got all these landscape restoration projects that we're going to do, but it all ties to that water, into that air, into all of these connecting kind of environmental impacts that go much larger and beyond just the tribal landscape that we ostensibly manage. So when I'm talking about scale, the need for partnerships is going to be absolutely paramount as we move forward in combating climate change. And I think a lot of people sometimes are really worried about how things are going to look in the future. I'm really worried about how things are going to look in the future. But just having that knowledge of how adaptable the world is, seeing how quickly it comes back after we make some of these reparations, gives me a lot of hope that if we can all just get on the right track and kind of work with nature in order to implement this healing that we need to do, we're going to get a lot of synergy and a lot more positive feedback than we can even imagine. So the scale is big is the point of the story. There's a lot to do, but we can do it when we come together to do it.
Well, so true. And thinking big and acting big, so important in climate change. The Klamath River dam removal, led by tribes for decades, is a great example. As you point out, salmon coming back days after those dams were removed when biologists thought it might be years. And when I think about the impacts of climate change on our environment, we're going to need that connectivity of ecosystems. We're going to need that scale of restoration and environmental protection. One of the reasons I'm really excited about 30 by 30 is, enabling that climate refugia for the plants and animals and the connectivity. So, Tiana, huge thanks for thinking big and acting big in your part of the world.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I next want to introduce Don Hankins. Don is many things. He is Miwok. He is a professor at the California State University at Chico. He is a leader of the Indigenous Stewardship Network, and he's a colleague that's taught me a lot, particularly about Indigenous practices of wildfire and good fire on the land. Don, welcome. Good to see you again.
Thanks for having me on. So great
Yeah.
to be on here.
So I'm interested, I've actually gotten out on the land with you and understood more about the indigenous practices, and actually all this good fire, cultural fire has so shaped the way now we're managing landscapes. How do you view climate change, and how do you, view its impact on the work that you're involved in and the indigenous stewardship that you help to lead?
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, I want to kind of lead off with some of the things that Tiana was talking about in sense of like the role of condor as such an important species to us. And I think that if we think about long-term climate change and we understand the interactions with condor specifically, it's a species that in the last, time period of say 10,000 years, we know that it spanned the continent and its range restricted over time. But the stories of condor being in existence across places like Canada and the eastern U.S. and in the Pacific Northwest, those stories still remain. But the stories tie into the need to steward the land. They tie into the prevalence of fire within the landscape as well. And so, when I think about those responsibilities that we carry, those are brought forward by condor. But getting to your question in terms of like how we look at and change, look at the effects of climate change and those sorts of things, it really comes down to the ideas of observation and how we combine the ability of our traditional knowledge systems, our indigenous knowledge systems, and feed that into the work that we do, so that it's not just a past thinking of what indigenous practices are, but what the futurity of indigenous stewardship is, and that's really based observation. So, as a Miwok traditional cultural practitioner from the Bay Delta region, in our language in Miwok Hanai, we recognize that there are 5 seasons, and my whole work is really focused on looking for those indicators of the season, what's going on from season to season, how is that changing in time. And in lifetime, I've noticed that there have been shifts to those sorts of things. When certain weather phenomena, for instance, are happening and when they're not happening. Why is that happening? Those sorts of things are things that we're very carefully paying attention to. Some of the indicators that really stand out to me, I notice things like the prevalence of like the monsoonal moisture coming off of the Great Basin and the summer months, and when it happens and when it doesn't happen, the amount of winter fog that we have in the Central Valley, for instance, the lack of dew that I'm seeing more recently are some of the things that feed into that. And when we pay attention to that and we tie it to more the ecological side of things, like how does that influence where, maybe the flowering of certain plants like buckeye, or how certain insects might be coming out of their hibernation and getting into breeding, and the same with birds and the migration of species. These are all things that ultimately feed into the way that we're having to look at this. And so there are changes that are happening, and if we're not carefully paying attention to those kind of changes in the landscape, then our stewardship practices may be out of sync and actually become detrimental. You think about what you mentioned about 30 by 30 and the importance of that, is important to us in terms of how we steward those lands. And if we're not paying attention carefully to, say, when we fire in the landscape, we could have an adverse impact not only on the land, but then all the other things that are connected to the land as well. And so those are really important factors that I think come about. And I would say that in like recent decades, I've really seen this shift happening. The shifting of when certain plants are flowering, like buckeyes, for instance. My elders had shared with me that that was one of the first plants to flower in the springtime. And nowadays, sometimes see it where it's flowering out of sync and out of order with the ways that the elders had talked about it. And I wonder, well, why is that happening? Is it a local condition? Is it something else? And those sorts of things. And then also thinking about how some of the plant materials that we interact with and steward for, and one, thinking about like the nettles that we use for making fish nets and things like that. Like they are traditionally gathered after they've gone dormant, and with a warmer winter season without a hard frost, those sorts of plants aren't going into their dormancy, and they're not dying back, so that we can actually collect them safely without being impacted. So those kind of indicators are really important around the fire side of things, and how we might apply fire in the landscape. And then also just thinking of how when the fire, as we look at the current state of wildfire, and the increase in the fire size and the impacts of fire severity, a lot of that's obviously linked to these collection of knowledges that I'm talking about, the seasonal winds, the availability of moisture in the air, and those sorts of things. So yeah, lots of different impacts there.
Wow. And Don, I love the very specific examples of all of these changes driven by climate change that impact, traditional practices. So what's the go forward? What does this look like moving forward? As from where I sit in state government, we're really embracing and learning from these indigenous ways and these so-called traditional ecological practices and starting to build them, hopefully learn from them and build them into the work that we're doing, even amidst climate change. But how are you, continuing to drive forward on all of these practices and adjust them via climate change?
Yeah, that's another really good question. I think that the biggest opportunity that's there is really about one is uplifting the ways that Indigenous knowledge can be put into a leadership role here. So it's not about extracting knowledge from Indigenous communities about how to steward, but actually, like the work that your agency is doing in terms of co-stewardship and co-management is a really big part of that. And I would say, like, if we can do things that help to elevate, like Tiana was talking about with the land back, those kinds of things are really important for getting Indigenous peoples back onto the land and having access to help steward and help the state in partnership with other entities to be able to do that work is going to be tremendous. And I think about some of the specific examples of that I'm involved with, as a co-founder for the Indigenous Stewardship Network. I'm proud to say that we're actually, reallocating funds through the climate investment funding through the sorry, I'm blank Regional Fire Forest City Grant Kindling Fire Program. And so that program specifically allows for tribal organizations and cultural practitioners to be able to seek funding to support the reapplication of Indigenous fire to different places. So if you're interested in that, for folks who are listening, like they can contact the Indigenous Stewardship Network to learn more about it. That's through partnership with the Department of Conservation and their funding through that program. The other side of it, in terms of work that we're doing is, my own research, for instance, on the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, which I know you've come out and visited with us and walked the land out there. Unfortunately, during 2024, the summer of 2024, the park fire burned through the ecological reserve, but it's a place where we've been applying these principles of Indigenous stewardship in partnership with Mechoopda and some of our other local tribal partners, and really focused on the stewardship of our oak woodlands, our grasslands, and chaparral ecosystems. And interestingly, in the aftermath of this, massive wildfire, the one thing that we really notice is that, the places where we have been applying the stewardship repeatedly in time and paying attention to these seasonal shifts have been most resilient to the effects of fire. And kind of building on that, and this is, again, support from CNRA with funding from CAL FIRE and the Forest Health Research Program is, studies that we're doing about redeveloping the mosaics of fire in chaparral and oak woodlands in the post-fire landscape. And then one thing that I would just add as a kind of follow that the greater innovations that are there around some of the things that we wouldn't necessarily associate with fire, and that is to specifically call out some of the opportunities that I'm engaged in currently in our own homelands in the Delta, where we're working alongside partnerships with Metropolitan Water District and also the Department of Water Resources in Delta Island stewardship to restore wetlands. And fire is a big part of that. So what we're finding is that, there's an opportunity there to steward to help with, fighting sea level rise and also in enhancing the climate sequestration or carbon sequestration aspects by burning in these wetlands. And we'll be kicking off a project in the near future with DWR to beta test some of that on Twitchell Island in the very near future. So I'm really excited to be able to share that kind of stuff with you guys.
Yeah, that is so cool. And Tiana talked about scale and partnerships, and those are good examples of both.
Mhm.
Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, you have, CSU land next to Machupta land. That's an ancestral land return funded by the state. And you're talking about, land stewardship, both for the health of the landscape, but then also the restoration of the fishery and the fish up the creek. And then to your point, like scientifically monitoring the impacts of fire on those landscapes and how traditional practices actually protect the health of the landscapes even as we experience the fire. So, Don, huge thanks for all you continue to do.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Next, I'm really excited to bring Erica Lopez on screen. Erica is Secretary of the California Indian Basket Weavers Association, which is a really important organization that is guiding the way that state government supports the leadership of California tribes. Erica, great to see you. Is that your background, or are you really under a tree right now?
Yeah, I am outside right now. It's kind of spotty with Wi-Fi right now because of the storm and everything. So I was
Oh,
like, I
well,
had to be outside.
Well, you're coming through, right? You're coming through really good.
Okay,
Hey, for
good.
those who don't know what the Basket Weavers Association is all about, maybe I'll just start off with a question of what is that organization, and then maybe invite you to start to talk about the work that it does and the cultural practices that you all are stewarding.
Okay. Yeah. So the California Indian Basket Weavers Association, or CIBA, started in the early 90s, and it started in Northern California. And a lot of it was more, a lot of weavers wanted a safe group, a safe place really to gather and weave and to be able to utilize and promote and revitalize something that's dying essentially. A lot of people don't weave, and there was a time when weavers were scarce. Um, so that's what the whole organization was started off of. It was started to get people to start weaving again and to teach it and to be able to show them like, hey, this is something you guys can do. And then as it's grown over the years, we represent the whole state of California. So Southern, Central, and Northern are all represented here. I'm part of the Southern tribes. So I'm mainly down here in Southern California. But a lot of us will, we want to promote and emphasize the dangers that our weavers face, which a lot of it is eco changes. And yeah, a lot of pesticides was a big thing that actually harms us too. So when we go around, we teach people, what's safe, what's not safe, what to do, what you can do, what you can't do. Where you should gather is a big thing too, because there's no safe place to gather anymore. We never know what is sprayed, what's contaminated, what has potential to harm us, because we do put a lot of things in our mouth. So a lot of things get ingested unintentionally. So that a main thing for us is, to teach that, to teach, safety, and that you guys can do this now. It's not scary. You guys can do it. Nobody's going to take it away from you.
That's incredible. And part of, my education on the Basket Weavers Association was the work that the organization did with Caltrans that was
Yes.
doing certain spraying of pesticides on the side of roads and in certain areas where basket weavers were collecting plants and materials. And of
Yeah.
course, You know, if you're putting, in order to weave, if you're putting something in your mouth that has pesticides, terribly dangerous.
Yeah, it is. And that was a big, that's one of the big things that we can do. And we do because gathering locations are scarce. I mean, I've been gathering since I was a little girl, and some places I've gone, I can't go anymore because it's contaminated.
That's incredible. Well, huge thanks for what this organization has done. And I'm interested in, like, how you view climate change and the changing of the seasons. Is that impacting the plants that you all are using? How do you envision these eco changes, as you say, impacting basket weaving? And what are your thoughts about, how we address that?
So eco changing does affect plant growth a lot. I was always taught there's a certain time of year that you can gather certain plants. Our basket materials essentially too. We gather different parts of the year because it's stronger, it's healthier, and it'll be a lot easier to weave with. But sometimes it doesn't work that way. I've gathered, I want to say in November, some deer grass, and this time around it's not ready. It's
Hmm.
still very fresh. It's not coming up as well. Some of it's really short, some of it's really dry in the middle. Like it's just not the same. Sometimes it's ready in February. Sometimes it's ready in March or June, which is sometimes common, but with the lack of water, the lack of sunlight in some areas, and just with construction and new roads being built, more pollutions are being added. And a lot of people, we are very careless about what we pour. Even when we pour something on the ground, we're contaminating the ground. We're
Hmm.
contaminating the soil, and everything starts in the soil.
Wow. Well, and what would you recommend for those, those of us, whether we're in government or we're in communities, non-native communities, how can we support the continuity of this cultural practice? What would you have, what would you recommend for people that want to support these cultural lifeways, even amidst all these changes?
A big thing I like to emphasize to people is just know that what we're doing affects not just, it doesn't, if I pour like a soda on the ground, it may not look like it affects something, but I'm affecting the earth now. I added something that it should not have in there. If I go to the ocean and I leave trash, I just affected the ocean. If I go up into the mountain ranges and I leave some contaminants up there, the rainwater is going to bring it down the mountain into a stream, and it's going to contaminate that stream. That's potentially watering some junkus, or it's watering some deer grass or some sumac. Um, a lot of that, it may look small, but it's hurting. It's hurting us. And we might not feel it now, but we're going to feel it later. Trash and everything is a big pollution, light pollution, smog from our cars, all that's a big contaminant. But the biggest thing I recommend people do is know what you're putting into the earth, know what you're spraying onto the earth. And earth is alive. We're here. We make a relationship with everything. I'm currently under this tree and I have a relationship with this tree. I know it's protecting me from any potential rain that's going to come down on me, possibly any minute. Who knows? Um, I know she's going to protect me though, and I know she's sheltering me from the birds, and I know the squirrels are underneath here with me. We're all together and we're all one. The squirrels are currently 10 feet away from me. They know I'm not going to hurt them, and they're safe. They feel safe because they know I'm not going to do that to them. I have that relationship with them. I have that relationship with the plants, the trees, the soil, the air, the wind. That's something that we need to remember. We have relations and we need to protect those relations because if we don't protect them, they're not going to protect us.
Hmm. Such a powerful lesson for us all. One thing I'll say is, as I've kind of learn more, is Western science, which has brought a lot of knowledge, it tends to separate things, separates into species and
Yeah.
between species, etc. And one of the most powerful lessons from California Native American tribes I've learned is just the interconnectivity of this all, and it's
Yes.
impossible to pull one thing out from the other. We need to have this broad comprehensive health, as you explain, like living systems are living.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Erica, huge thanks for all you're doing and for joining us. And it looks like even holding the camera in front of that beautiful tree.
Thank
Really
you. Thank you
appreciate
for having
all you're
me.
doing. Yeah. So listen, we have learned so many lessons in state government from California Native American tribes. And to Don's point, it's really all about supporting tribal leadership
Yeah.
and following the lead of tribes stewarding California. And so our last panelist is a great person to talk about this with. It is Bryce Lewis Smith. Bryce is a member of the Potawatomi Nation. We're lucky to have Bryce as a team member in state government for the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate. Land use and climate. And Bryce, you are at this intersection of science, the state's investment in science, and recognizing these indigenous practices and lifeways that are so important to the way that we move forward. So, if you would talk a little bit about what you're doing at the Office of Land Use and Climate in California, and then if you would start to talk about how we're trying to reconcile our so-called, traditional Western science approach with indigenous knowledge.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm so grateful to be here and honored to share this space with the other panelists. Bojo Jayak, Bryce Nadeznikas, Bodwan Mindao, Nishnanavendao. My name is Bryce Lewis Smith, and I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. I'm the Senior Tribal Research Engagement Specialist for the Governor's Office of Land Use and Climate Innovation, formerly known as the Office of Planning and Research. In my position, I manage the Tribal Research Program of California's Climate Change Assessment, which is an interagency collaboration between LCI, the Natural Resources Agency, the Energy Commission, and the Strategic Growth Council, which brings together a collection of regional and topical reports and is a set of original research and new data and tools detailing the impacts of climate change and how California is building climate resiliency. The Tribal Research Program of California's fifth climate change assessment grew from recommendations captured in the Tribal and Indigenous Communities Report of the fourth assessment, whose lead author was North Fork Chairman Ron Good. That input focused on how to improve California's climate assessments, tribal engagement, representation, and relevancy. The fourth assessment was the first time that the California climate assessments actually included tribal perspectives and priorities. And like many firsts, there were many opportunities to build bridges to make sure that we're improving how the state includes Indigenous perspectives moving forward. Based on the input of the fourth assessment, as well as statutory direction from SB 1320, sponsored by Senator Stern in 2022, we formed a whole program focused on tribal research. This inaugural tribal research program includes our tribal advisory group, which is made up of 10 tribal representatives who were nominated by tribal leaders across California. We're really lucky that Tiana is one of our tribal advisory group members. And the tribal advisory group guide the fifth assessment's program structure, our tribal engagement and data sovereignty protocols. While they serve as a direct connection to community, they do not replace the need for government to government consultation. But yeah, they've been essential in making sure that we're embedding Indigenous worldviews throughout each aspect of the fifth assessment.
It's so cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. We're really grateful for her. We also have our tribal research grant program, which provides $3.6 million to 18 different tribally led climate projects across California. These projects emphasize tribal sovereignty and self-determination. The guidelines for the grant weren't prescriptive, telling the tribes what they had to do with this funding, because we know that the tribes know their climate priorities better than we do, right? So it was kind of this open forum of what they get to choose to do. And then they get to opt into sharing those research findings within the fifth assessment if that seems correct for them as well. And then we also have our Tribal and Indigenous Communities Report, which is authored by Don Hankins here. Grateful to have him working on that, but it's the continuation of the fourth assessment's report to track how the state is meeting the goals and recommendations set out in the fourth assessment. It's led by California tribal members for California tribes. So we're really excited to have that partnership. And yeah, we're really grateful for funding too appropriated in the 2021 climate budget that's allowed us to compensate every tribal member that we're working with throughout the fifth assessment, on the regional reports, topical reports, as well as through the tribal advisory group and our research grant program.
This is a really big deal, Bryce, in my mind. So to break this down for folks, there used to be a national climate assessment, and that's like the best scientists around the country understanding, updated data, science on climate change, how it's going to impact different parts of the country, and what we can do about it. Remarkably, the federal administration, the Trump administration, has completely canceled the national climate assessment, and so that has basically been shut down. The good news is California has been doing its own climate assessment for some time, like 20 years. And we're on our fifth climate assessment, always getting in that new information, that new research to understand what are the impacts on California and what can we do about it. Bryce, to your point, that fourth, it wasn't until the fourth assessment, but it happened in the fourth, that there was the recognition that traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, is critically important to how we manage and continue to thrive in climate change. And that began the interaction with tribal science and tribal experts. And then now the fifth climate assessment, which is going to be completed next year, actually integrates that, recognizing that we need this tribal knowledge and this tribal science to inform how we steward California. So I'm really excited with the piece that Don is producing and leading for this. I'm really excited that tribes are getting state funding to do their own work, and that we're going to be informed by that. Bryce, something you talk about, or you inferred, is just the respect that the state and non-native governments have to have for that knowledge, because I think it was Tiana or somebody said so much of the traditional relationship has been extractive, taking the information. Can you just talk about this balance around how we are informed by tribal knowledge without extracting it in inappropriate ways?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there's a big moment right now within the environmental movement, right, that recognizes the importance of traditional ecological knowledge. A lot of different states, counties, local governments, et cetera, want to embed indigenous knowledge throughout their plans, right? But indigenous knowledge can't be separated from indigenous peoples, right? That knowledge is deeply embedded within our communities. And so if we want to make sure that we're embedding tribal knowledge, right, weaving these perspectives throughout our plans and making sure that California is set for to be climate resilient to climate change, sorry, we need an indigenous leadership, right? We need to be focusing on uplifting indigenous youth to step into those positions of leadership. Yeah. So yeah.
That's so true. So you've now, you're interacting with a lot of tribal experts. I mean, how do you see tribes leading on climate adaptation and resiliency in the state?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to everything that Erica, Don, and Tiana were speaking about earlier, right? We're seeing tribes revitalizing indigenous stewardship practices, right? Restoring cultural burning across regions to reduce wildfire risk and revitalize culturally important plant species, reintroducing traditional tending, pruning, seeding, and gathering practices that strengthen ecosystem resilience. Tribes are advancing sovereignty in land and water governance, leading efforts to co-manage ancestral lands with state and federal agencies, as well as reclaiming and rematriating land to restore stewardship responsibilities, right? Tiana was talking about that land back effort happening up at Yurok, right? It's so important that the land is returned to tribal hands, right? Tribes are also conducting community-driven climate research, right, that embed tribal adaptation priorities within their vulnerability assessments and making sure that they're using cultural monitoring methods, right? I think earlier you were talking about the separation between Western knowledge and indigenous knowledges, right? Where Western sciences don't necessarily see the relationships and the spirituality aspects of those relationships with land, whereas indigenous folks, since time immemorial have had those relationships with land, right? There's that deep connection that Tiana was talking about earlier. And so, yeah, tribes are using both Western knowledges as well as connecting back to their ancestral knowledges to weave this amazing methodology to care for the land, right? Tribes are demonstrating that climate resilience is strongest when rooted within indigenous knowledge. They model governance approaches that center reciprocity, responsibility, and long-term care. Yeah,
Yeah.
tribes are reshaping how the state approaches climate policy as key partners and decision makers.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, this is truly a paradigm shift. We've talked about it before that, our state government is on a journey, and the journey for me started when the governor issued his formal apology, first governor to do
Mhm.
that to California Native American tribes, for 175 years um, of really challenged history. And we
Mhm.
said at the time it was an important step, but there was so much more that we needed to do. And so since then, at our agency, we've been really focused on ancestral land return, co-stewardship, supporting the leadership of tribes driving that indigenous knowledge and figuring out ways to integrate that in respectful ways to the work that we're doing. And Bryce, I'm with you. Climate change challenges us in so many ways, and we need to have a healthy lands, healthy environment, healthy people to weather this. And it's going to be California Native American tribes leading the way to ensure that we do that. So I'm really appreciative of how integrated, that tribal engagement leadership is in the next version of science. We're really excited for the fifth climate assessment. Maybe last question before we go to the group. When can people expect this fifth climate assessment and these different products to come out on tribal science?
Yeah, thank you. We are working on our rollout schedule right now, but we're looking at potentially October 2026. And there's going to be a large lead up of rollout events. And yeah, one huge rollout event in Sacramento. It's going to be embedded with ceremony and cultural celebrations, honoring all the different tribal communities who've contributed to the climate assessment. So yeah, it's going to be a
Incredible.
great time.
Excellent. Well, listen, let's bring everyone back in a group for the remainder of our time here. Got a little less than 15 minutes. We've got some great questions coming in. Um, I have a question maybe for Don. Milton says they're establishing a regenerative burning training program, and the group includes a Native American partner with extensive cultural burning knowledge. They want to integrate that cultural knowledge into ecosystem restoration, healing. So it sounds like the organization is just developing. Where and as they come together, they're going to be seeking opportunities to present the vision, secure funding, find partners. What would you say to people like Milton that are looking to do this work and partner with tribes? Where can they find support or encouragement?
Yeah, I would say, one of the biggest resources that's potentially there is actually the Indigenous Stewardship Network. I mean, that's really the intent of the organization is to support cultural practitioners in particular, and then also help, kind of support the partnerships that are emerging between different organizations. And I think, depending on where you're at in the state, Milton and others who may be, looking to develop these sorts of things, there may be more localized examples. For instance, up in Tiana's neck of the woods, the Cultural Fire Management Council and the Crook Tribe both have really good programs that they have developed. And there's similar types of programs that are emerging in the Sierras and even down south in the areas where Eric is at. So, it just kind of depends on where you're at, but the Indigenous Stewardship Network can help at least guide people to different places if you're looking for that.
Awesome. And then, Don, one of our colleagues, Adina, points out she wanted to thank you for co-chairing the California Biodiversity Network Stewardship Roundtable. And Adina says all are welcome to join. So that might be a great place for folks to build their network. So I'd ask Geeta if you can put out on the chat the link to the cabiodiversitynetwork.org. That'd be great because people can plug in that way as well.
Yeah,
Um,
I was
yeah,
remiss in mentioning that too. I would just say anybody can join that network, and it's a great network of practitioners from all over the place, including tribal and academic and whatnot. So if folks want to join in there and learn different techniques, there's somebody out there probably across the state that can help in that space.
that's excellent. I think Erica lost her connection. I don't think I see her anymore, but Daniel asked a question. Have there been changes to Caltrans roadside spraying practices due to education and feedback from the California Indian Basket Weavers Association? I believe I was hoping to ask Erica that question, but I believe the answer is yes. The way it was described to me, actually, the basket weavers engaged Caltrans, and it got Caltrans to modify where and how they spray in certain parts of the state because basket weavers were actually going in some as I was explained to me, these disturbed areas, sometimes on the side of highways, are really good places to collect, but they have the pesticides. So I actually think that is a success story, or where tribal government, tribal communities informing the state has led to changes. Um, so good stuff there. Um, Question from Felipe, which is, what does the future of empowering tribes look like? Felipe would like to hear more about permanent and stable sources of funding and support for staff for tribes beyond temporary grants. And I'll say this is an ongoing challenge. I feel good about the fact that we are now trying to find where there are set asides within programs for tribes so that there's can be transfer of funding from state government to tribal governments for this. That's happened, for example, on some of our wildfire programs. But unfortunately, that those are still episodic, or they exist, based on the budget, sort of the year to year budget availability. So I would say it's a work in progress. But Bryce or Don, anything you'd add there?
Sorry, I was looking for my unmute. Yeah, I would say, like as we think about this kind of work, the one of the key things is not to think about it based on a project by project. And I know Secretary Crowfoot's heard me say this repeatedly, like we need to stop using the term project when we're talking about these stewardship things because they're cyclical. We need to come back in and keep doing them. So when we develop the funding around these sorts of things, we need to be thinking about, okay, if it's a grant, how does that grant include a set aside for the long-term maintenance of some of these things, if it's burning or whatever it is, and so the state can only go so far. We're not going to probably continue to tax people and develop bonds around some of these ideas. So how do we get the investment from communities and our like business partners and things like that to help support it? And I think as we start to engage in it, hopefully the initial cost comes down as we're re-entering back into places, and so it's a little bit easier to maintain once the initial investment's been made.
Yeah. A pipeline of funding. So it's not just a one and done or a mission accomplished, because stewardship is ongoing. So true. So Mary asks the question, this is a great one. How are tribal communities documenting and adapting traditional ecological knowledge and about seasonal indicators like plant phenology or specific weather patterns when those indicators are shifting due to climate change? And what role can agencies play in supporting this knowledge preservation work? So maybe a question for you, Don or Bryce, are, have you heard how tribal scientists or tribal communities are documenting these changes? And is there a role that we can play in that work?
I'm gonna maybe defer quickly to Tiana just to see if Tiana, as a person working
Oh
for a
yeah, I
tribal
didn't see
life
Tiana. So
department,
sorry.
yeah, and then I can always jump in
Oh my
too.
gosh, Tiana and Erica, I'm so sorry. I thought you guys were off screen. Um, yeah, so I only saw Bryce and Don. My apologies.
Worries. Well, I'm not sure what you're looking for me specifically, Tom, but I was thinking in terms of kind of that traditional ecological knowledge. There's a lot of things that are inherent to it that give you indicators of the phenology and how things should be looking. I remember when I was a kid, I was growing up, I was taught that the frogs will start singing Kitween, Kitween. Around January, that means that Kitween, the eel, are coming up the river about that time. And that's sure enough when you'll go out and you'll capture the eels for eating and things like that. Ourselves, we also have both a cultural community, cultural committee and a natural resource committee. which I've been privileged to be involved with quite a bit, and just the stories that come out about not only shifts in timeline, but the ways that shifts in the landscape have changed the way that the system is working, like losing all of our redwoods. Now, mist transpiration works very differently. There's a lot of different weather patterns upriver than there used to be from downriver. Along with that, of course, that's where Western science comes in, because Western science is very uniquely situated to capture these moments in time, complementarily to this kind of long-term assessment that traditional ecological science has. So that said, for example, you might look at, and I'm just talking lots of examples of it. I'm just talking Europe because that's what I know. Our fisheries department or our environmental department, we are constantly measuring water quality, water temperature. That's being tied to when are the fish moving up? What is the health of the fish? What are the impacts here or there? Until we kind of get this large body of constantly, like glacially but hugely moving body of knowledge that's kind of telling us what's going on. Again, always going back to kind of those historical norms and how they might be diverging.
Yeah. So helpful understanding the sort of the relative benefits of the traditional knowledge and the indigenous knowledge and the Western science and how they can be merged. Erica, I didn't see you on the screen, so I hoped I answered that question about Caltrans right, but I just maybe put it to you on any thoughts you have around are the basket weavers feeling like state agencies are being responsive to the gathering needs and the cultural needs, or you have suggestions about how we can do better?
You answered great. First off, I would like to applaud you for that. You did a really good job. Yeah, and I feel like some government agencies are listening to us and are taking initiative. I feel like some are still kind of like hesitant to fully like listen. I feel like they're listening, but they're not hearing us. Like they just like pick and choose the words they want to hear, which is okay, but it's not the best. So I feel like, in some places, in some ways, in some agencies, it's just, when they're ready, they'll listen. We
Yeah.
can't make them. And that's something I like to emphasize among people because they just want to make people listen, but we can't. We can't do that, unfortunately. If we could, a lot of things would be done.
Yeah. I feel like in my own observation, we're making improvements. I think there was a criticism that state agencies used to sort of do government to government consultations or seek tribal input as like a check the box exercise.
Yep.
After decisions were made. And what we have moved towards, or what we're always trying to move towards, is actually engaging early so that the engagement and the input actually shapes the decision, right?
Yep.
And I think it's great on the climate science. What Bryce was talking about with this fifth climate assessment is like really getting the tribal knowledge to shape the way that we're moving forward. So I'm going to be interested to see how the fifth climate assessment comes out on this. No pressure, Bryce. So listen, let's do one speed round to end here. It's been a really great discussion. Somebody asked a question about whether there would be a recording or a transcript, and I just want to repeat for folks that you can go on our website by tomorrow morning, and you'll get both the recording as well as all the information that Geeta's been providing in chat. So let's do a speed round, which is, climate change can be discouraging, often alarming. But I want to ask you a question. What's one thing that gives you hope in the face of climate change for future generations? And anybody can start off. Just take yourself off mute. Tiana.
Right. I'll start with what I always consider my cheesy answer because it's totally cheesy. But my mother, she's just this amazing little person who cares about so many things. She can speak knowledgeably about why condors are important ecologically. I remember the first time she watched a fire documentary actually put out by the Cultural Fire Management Council. She's like, fire helps the land, and so she absorbs oh my gosh, she's so amazing. She's just a kid, but kids are amazing. It's the point of the story. I remember her talking about how leaders have to be honest and kind. And I'm like, okay, dude, you're like going to be our next president. Give me 18 years for your campaign. Um, it is cheesy, but I really am so impressed by the way that our young people are being brought up, and not just Indigenous, but throughout our California communities, to really understand their role and what they want their future to look like.
Oh, amazing. Thank you, Tiana.
I can go next. I think similar to Tiana, the next generation is really carrying the torch. We're in this moment of resurgence within our Indigenous communities, right? I believe Governor Newsom called it like an Indigenous renaissance, right, here in California. I think there's a big moment of returning to our culture, getting power into Native communities, right? And setting up the next generation to be those leaders, right? Opening doors for those who are following us. I'm an uncle of two now. My niece is barely one, and my nephew's just turned three. And just seeing them gives me hope. The way that they interact with the land and knowing that they're going to have access to their culture and their traditional homelands. Yeah,
Incredible.
definitely the
Thank
next
you.
generation.
Don, I saw you take yourself off mute.
Yeah, I think kind of echoing both Tiana and Bryce, it's like the future generations is really key. I see a lot of encouragement in the folks particularly engaging in some of the work that I've highlighted today in the presentation. But I think, like recognizing that this is not just a short-term thing. We've got a long-term vision, and we're going to need people stepping in to help out with that. And I think there's folks that are willing and able, and I think it's everybody's responsibility to engage where they can. So I'm encouraged by that.
Incredible. Erica, under that beautiful tree.
Um, I'm actually really proud of the younger generation. I see a lot of it in my community, and a lot of them are stepping up. And I want to say a lot of them are healed from past trauma from that's been passed down to them. And a lot of them are healing and seeing what's right, what's wrong, and that they can make that change now. They're not scared. So I'm actually really hopeful that the next younger generation, they're going to step up. They're leading. We don't see it, but they're leading. Every day they're making those changes that need to be made. So I'm really optimistic about it.
Oh, incredible. I'm so excited for the continuation of all that the Basket Weavers Association is doing. What encourages me on this topic is actually our Native American leaders across California. This 7 years has been an incredible experience in appreciating just the patience, the open-mindedness, the open-heartedness of California Native American communities working with the state amidst and despite such a troubled history and moving forward together. What Bryce said, it's such an interesting and important moment to get it right and to move forward in a holistic, in a sustainable way that really centers tribal leadership and tribal knowledge to guide all that. So I'm more encouraged on this front than I've ever been, even as we face so many challenges from climate change. So big thanks to the four of you for all that you do. We've been joined by over 300 people here today. Just shows how much resonance this topic has, as well as your leadership. You're getting all sorts of emoji love coming off the screen here. Big thanks to everybody who joined for what you're doing in your work, whether you represent a tribal government or community, or you're an ally, or you're in state government driving this change that we know we need. We are making progress with a lot more important work ahead. So thanks, everyone. And once again, happy Native American Heritage Month. Last point, if you have any questions, suggestions, hit us up at this email, secretarysuggestions@resources.ca.gov. Take care, and we'll see you again.